Hi, it's Geoff Chalmers here from discoverdouble-bass.com. That is the home of online video double bass lessons and courses. We've got a whole bunch of stuff over there, gear reviews, lessons. There's over 100 free lessons you can check out, as well as many step-by-step courses by some of the world's leading educators. And I'm really excited today because I'm introducing a brand new tutor to the website, somebody who's been a really big influence on me, both as a player, as a teacher, somebody who I've taken lessons from personally in the past. So let's welcome him, John Goldsby. Fantastic to have you here.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me. It's great.
It's been a great week. We've been hanging out here in Leeds, filming all week. We've had the pleasure of Jamil Sharif and Caroline Bowden's company. So we're set up to do the trio stuff today. And I thought it'd be great if we could take a little bit of time out, introduce you to the Discover Double Bass audience, and then maybe talk a little bit about some of the concepts that we discuss in the course, and some things that will help the students out there, people that are learning about the double bass and its role in jazz, and maybe a few other sort of topics such as gear, what kind of things you're using in terms of strings and what have you, the stuff that people want to know. So maybe you could start off by telling us a little bit about where you are now, because you've got a really unusual job in the WDR Big Band in Germany. So maybe talk a little bit about your current situation, and are you doing any teaching, or is it all performance?
Well, I've been playing with the WDR Big Band. WDR stands for Westdeutscher Rundfunk, West German Radio. So WDR Big Band, and I joined the band in 1994.
Wow.
So I left a long stint in New York City, and I picked up roots, and my wife and I moved to Germany in 94, and I've been playing with the band about 25 years now.
It's amazing.
And it's a full-time big band. It's similar to an orchestra position. We do maybe 50 concerts a year, 60 concerts a year, and we're in the studio the rest of the time rehearsing or recording. And we generally play concerts in our area of Germany, the North Rhine-Westphalia area, but we also travel all through Germany and Europe, and also overseas every once in a while.
It's such a fascinating gig. We've been talking about this a lot in the car, and the opportunity to meet some of the best players in the world, and to be playing alongside some of the best players in the world, because I think the band is absolutely killer, all the way through the sections. It's really a really wonderful thing. How did you find the transition from freelancing in New York? Because in my mind, that feels like the complete opposite in terms of, racing around on the subway and getting from gig to gig, in terms of, presumably you have your bass set at the studio. How does it look compared to that?
Right, it's the polar opposite of a hustle and bustle freelance career, because I do rehearse and record in the same studio day after day with usually the same band. It's a fixed band. And so it was quite a transition when I moved from New York to Germany. In New York, I was doing hundreds and hundreds of gigs every year, 2 gigs a day, 3 gigs a day, if I could work it out, because all the gigs in New York are concentrated in a small geographical area. So it's possible, if you like to play a lot, it's possible to work in a lot of different spots in New York. There are a lot of great bass players in New York, and there are a lot of people who are just freelancing in all styles of music, so the level's very high. When I moved to Germany and joined this band, it's an incredible big band, and the playing level is really high. When I joined the band, the the principal conductor was Bill Dobbins.
Oh.
And so I worked with Bill, leading the band for many years, and then Michael Abeni took over as principal conductor for many years after Dobbins. And then currently we have Vince Mendoza as the composer in residence, and Bob Mincer is the principal conductor. So we're always alternating between these world-class big band writers, and Bob's, of course, a great tenor soloist. And so they do probably 60 days a year, and then we have other guest conductors and arrangers for the other 150 days or so.
So what does an average week with the big band? I'm going to have to come back to New York in a moment as well, but let's maybe work backwards. What does an average week look like for you? Do you kind of a few days rehearsal and a concert? How often are you in there?
Well, usually we work project by project. So we'll have a project that lasts a week or 2 weeks. So we'll rehearse say Monday through Friday. Usually the rehearsals are 10 in the morning till 2:30 in the afternoon. The first couple of days we play through the new program of music, rehearse things, check for any copying mistakes, kind of get a feel for the music, and then we start recording everything. We might make a YouTube video, or we might record for eventually an album release or a radio broadcast, and then we'll do 1, 2, or 3 concerts with that particular project. And so that whole process lasts maybe a week or 7 days, or sometimes it lasts 2 weeks, and then we move on to the next project. So then we get a new batch of music, a new challenge, a new guest soloist, or a new arranger. So it's, for me, I love it. It's a fantastic situation because the music's always changing, and it's very demanding, but it also challenges me to try and stay on top of the game.
Yeah, I've listened to or watched a lot of the videos on YouTube and on Facebook, so definitely people should be subscribing to the WDR social channels, and I'll share links to those. And there's quite a lot that feature John specifically, and some of the arrangements, yeah, they're really complex. And I mean, are you getting the music in advance? Do you have like a music librarian who works for the band, and maybe, or is it kind of you turn up at the rehearsal, this is the rehearsal, off we go, open the charts?
In the past couple of years, we've started getting music in advance because most arrangers are sending their parts by PDF.
Of course.
Years ago, we would just show up on the first day, and there would be a new batch of handwritten, hand-copied music on the stand. And yeah, it was sometimes a little bit of a shock.
Yeah.
These days, yeah, usually I get the music in advance so I can peek through everything and look and see if there's something that I really need to spend some time with before the rehearsal.
Yeah.
And then, yeah, the first couple of days of rehearsal, it's usually getting to know the music, and then we have the luxury of getting to rehearse and then record and then perform the music. Sometimes we do get projects where we show up and there's a new chart, and but the band, everybody's a good sight reader, and we enjoy that challenge.
It's a real thrill, isn't it, playing with such a big group of people, and you're doing it at such a high level. It must be a really exciting process. I mean, in terms of some of the artists that you've worked with, specifically in the big band, maybe you could talk about some that might appeal to, I'm thinking bass players here, I'm thinking bass players and rhythm section, and I don't know, maybe any of the instrumentalists really. Are there some that jump out that you really enjoyed, or?
We've had a lot of great bass soloists.
Yeah. Do you have an influence in who comes, John? Because I have noticed that you've had Ray Brown, Christian McBride. There's been some really serious bass players going on here. Chuck Rainey, I think we mentioned. Or,
right. Yeah, Will Lee's been there.
Will
Eddie
Lee.
Gomez. Oh, wow. I don't have a lot of influence in determining the guest artists. But one thing I can say about that is I notice when the bass player or drummer changes, when a guest comes in, then the band of the sound of the band changes completely. So that's one thing you can't really say. If you change one of the horn players, it's still going to sound like the horn section.
But the drummer, it's
right.
Yeah,
if you change
the
drummer or the bass player, then the sound of the band changes completely. And I have the pleasure of playing with a good friend of mine who's a great drummer, Hans Decker. So he's the regular drummer with the band. And we have a great rapport and hookup rhythmically, and it's always fun to play with him. But then we also have guest drummers. Antonio Sanchez was with the band last year playing his music arranged by Vince Mendoza. Like we've talked about, Jeff Hamilton's been there in the past, or Dennis McCrell, John Riley, Peter Erskine's with us quite often. And so it's always great to have different input into the band. And I've noticed when the bass player or the drummer changes, then the sound of the band is completely different. So that testifies to the importance of the bass, even in a big band. In the past, we've had a lot of great bass soloists come and spend time with the band. A couple of the projects that stand out are with John Clayton. We've had John with Gerald Clayton together.
So John's son, who's an incredible pianist. And,
right.
Yeah.
And so I think there's some videos out there with John, and I'm playing I'd say second bass, and John's playing the lead parts.
Wow.
So those are always great projects, and we did a project with their super bass group with Ray Brown and Chris McBride and John Clayton, where I played bass in the big band, and these three guys were out front as the super bass trio. So that was fantastic. The project with Eddie Gomez was great, where we played the music of Bill Evans, but Eddie was the featured soloist with Elliot Zygmunt on drums.
Okay.
That was many years ago. Then we've had a lot of great electric bass players. Will Lee has played with the band, so I got to play with Will.
Oh, wow.
And he was such a generous, warm, musical spirit. So, yeah, for me, it's just an incredible gig, perfect gig for me.
I was looking at the schedule, and I thought maybe you've been bribing the fixer. I thought it seems very heavy in terms of just wonderful rhythm section play. I mean, the chance to play with Jeff Hamilton is just, and I think also it must be fascinating to hear other people play in the position that you play in and know so well. So you know that gig inside out, and then you can stand back and hear Christian McBride, playing in the same context and with the same musicians, and kind of hearing what they do differently. I just think it's so interesting. It's one of the reasons why I enjoy listening to bass players play standards, because it's the material that I play over all the time and you play over, and then we hear Eddie Gomez play Nardis, and it's a different world, isn't it? And to learn and experience that must just be a real joy. So
sure.
Such a gig, and so let's work backwards then in terms of go on, jump in.
Yeah, I can tell you one story about when Ray Brown was featured with the band with John Clayton conducting, and we were playing at the Berlin Jazz Festival, I believe, and we were doing the sound check, and Ray was out front, and I was basically playing the ensemble parts, and Ray and I would switch off, where he would play more featured parts, and then I would play with the ensemble. But Ray was finished with his sound check. He didn't want to play much more, and wanted to go back to the hotel or whatever. But the band still needed to sound check for the audio crew and the recording truck. So then Ray says, "Okay, well, yeah, Goldsby, you can play for me." And so then I had to step forward and play on Ray's bass in front of the band after Ray, which is daunting. But yeah, he was always very straight ahead about that. He didn't. He was extremely confident, but also very warm and supportive of younger players.
Absolutely.
The first time I met Ray was, I think, in New York. We shared the stage with the American Jazz Orchestra. That was a big band that I played with Mel Lewis, and John Lewis led the band. And we did a concert of Ellington music.
Oh. And
I played half the concert, and then Ray came out and he played the Jimmy Blanton features that had been recorded with Ellington, Sepia Panorama and Jack the Bear.
Oh, yeah.
And all those. So that I had contact with Ray over the years, but I always have great memories of him being on stage, and the standard that he set. It always put the energy level up a couple of notches when he was around.
I bet it did. So moving back to your time in New York, were you kind of getting out there, and I mean, must have been a really exciting time in terms of the players that were on the scene and the music that was being played. I mean, were you out there taking lessons with people? Were you, or did you get to hang with people like Ray Brown and perhaps, pick up a few things? Or what kind of stage were you at then? Or were you just doing freelancing and that was it? And
Well, when I moved to New York in 1980, I left Louisville, Kentucky, and I realized I had hit my peak in Louisville. It was a small, vibrant scene, but a small scene. So I had some friends in New York, so I put all my stuff in the car and just drove to New York and moved in with my friends, and then I was on the scene. And it was before actually all these jazz programs started, like at the New School and Manhattan School and New York University and all these schools that have jazz programs. So basically the model back then was still, you moved to New York, you went to jam sessions, you hung out in clubs, you tried to meet people, and then eventually you got gigs.
Yeah.
So I quickly got gigs that didn't pay very much. So I found myself working 7 nights a week
Sure.
from the start, with gigs that paid $5 or $10 or $25 and at that same time I was in New York. I remember the first night I went out, I went to Greenwich Village and I took the subway in from Brooklyn where I was staying, and I went around and I heard Ron Carter at one club, and Ron Carter. I'd never heard him live before, and I'm literally standing behind Ron Carter in a club called the Knickerbocker, and he's playing right in front of me, and I'm looking over his shoulder and looking at Hank Jones, and I was in jazz heaven. And then I went literally across the street to Bradley's, and I heard Red Mitchell.
Wow, another jazz legend.
Right, another jazz legend. And then I remember walking around later that night, and I think I passed the Village Gate, and I heard a bass inside, and the bass was, somebody was really playing, and I poked my head in the door, and it was Reggie Workman.
Oh.
So, and this was just within the course of a few hours, and I was really in bass heaven at that point.
Yeah.
So, between doing my little jazz gigs and trying to get established as a player, I started hanging out at clubs, and I got to know Michael Moore, was a bass player who I took lessons with early on. Fantastic teacher, and really had a great system for soloing and great thumb position system. And after I took lessons with Michael for a couple of years, I met Dave Holland, and I started taking lessons with Dave Holland. He was a big influence on me, and when I say taking lessons, I think maybe every 2 months I would either drive up to Saugerties, New York, near Woodstock where he lived, or sometimes he would come to New York and he'd call me and say, "Hey, you want to have a lesson? I'm in New York." And he would come to my apartment and we would hang out for the afternoon. So those were very special musical experiences for me. Later in my New York experience, I met Red Mitchell, and he was a very warm, friendly type guy.
Yeah.
And that came through in his music. When you hear him play, it's like he's talking to you through the bass. And Red actually heard me sit in on a gig that Michael Moore had. So Michael had this gig. I had been studying with Michael, and Michael said, "Well, come up and play a tune." It was with a piano player, Leanne Ledgerwood. And I forget what tune we played, but we played 1 or 2 tunes, and I came off the stand, and Red Mitchell was in the audience. And I went over, and Red was really generous. He really liked the way I played. And what he didn't know, at that time, I had been transcribing all his solos. I was doing everything to try and sound like Red Mitchell. So he was basically hearing like a young, immature version of his style of playing. So we became friends, and he actually hired me for some gigs where he played piano and I played bass.
Wow.
And I would hang out at Bradley's when he played there. He had a scene where he was living in Sweden, but he'd come back to New York for weeks at a time or a couple of months at a time, and he'd play at Bradley's one week with Kenny Barron, and the next week with
Kenny Barron's playing.
Tommy Flanagan, and then Cedar Walton.
Wow, so the greats.
Yeah, so he would kind of have his residency at Bradley's and play duo with all these great piano players.
On a Red Mitchell note, so Red had famously tuned his bass in fifths. Was that something that you ever experimented with or decided to, look into more, or was it kind of not something that appealed to you?
I tried it once, and I can see the appeal.
Right.
But it's not something... I fell in love with Red's playing with these older records that he recorded with Hampton Hawes, like All Night Sessions, Volume 1, 2, 3. And on those records, he was playing gut strings tuned in fourths.
Yes.
And also very melodic and super swinging. And that's my original concept of Red's sound.
Yeah.
And when he switched to tuning in fifths, he told me that he was on the LA scene, and he was doing a lot of session work. He was playing with Andre Previn quite a bit, the great piano player, composer, conductor. And he was getting a lot of calls, maybe as the second call to Ray Brown. And after a while, I think this got to Red that he didn't always want to play second fiddle to Ray Brown, as he said. So he wanted his own sound. He wanted to find his own voice. And he says that's the purpose of jazz, or the goal in jazz is to find your own voice. So I think he took a little vacation for about a week and experimented with this tuning in fifths, tuning C, G, D, A.
Yeah.
And then he went back and immediately played a big recording session with orchestra conducted by Andre Previn.
Oh.
And he went to Andre before the session and he said, Andre, if there are any funny notes that you hear coming from the bass, I'll explain later. And he played the session, and that was he never turned back. That was his jump into tuning in fifths. And he really did develop his own sound. He's one of the bass players where you can tell within one bar, one measure, oh, that's Red Mitchell.
Another person on that kind of in that zone really, who has a very identifiable sound and someone that sits really at the heart of jazz history, is Niels Henning Ørsted Pedersen. Right. And did you ever get the chance to meet him or hang out with him potentially, or?
I never hung out with him. I only heard him live once, and that was. I don't remember the occasion, but I remember I drove from Louisville to Chicago, which is probably a 5 or 6 hour drive, to hear Niels Henning and Oscar Peterson play in duo.
Oh.
So
wow.
That was the only time I heard him. And from what I gathered from the club, or the people who were working at the club, the set started really late. They said, well, Niels Henning is flying in from Europe and he hasn't arrived yet. So when he finally arrived at the club, I think 30 or 45 minutes late, he just, went to the bass, picked up the bass, and they hit it. And it was one of those also amazing things that I had never heard before. I'd never heard somebody play the bass in that style, with that kind of virtuosity and fluidity.
It's stunning, isn't it, really?
Yeah.
It's his playing, you hear it today and it's just still incredible in terms of virtuosity, and the way that he plays is so unique and so interesting. I mean, in terms of bass players, who are the kind of the big influences for you, do you think? I mean, for me, the kind of people I come back to time and time again, obviously Ray Brown. I'm thinking a lot about players like John Patitucci, Larry Grenadier, Christian McBride. They tend to feature quite heavily. Where were you coming from at that time with your playing? I mean, is Red Mitchell feels like he's somebody that perhaps is part of that? Maybe, I know there's so many bass players, and we could talk all day. Eddie Gomez, and so many more. But are there just a couple maybe that really stand out that you kind of feel this connection with?
Right. Well, I feel like I have a real connection to old style jazz. So I love the older players like Wellman Broad with the Duke Ellington Band, Jimmy Blanton with the Duke Ellington Band, and then for me the first modern bass player was Oscar Pettiford. So I feel like my foundation is in those players, and then filtered through maybe my experience. I started out on electric bass, playing rock music, then fusion music, and then I found the more straight ahead or mainstream jazz with Ron Carter, Paul Chambers, and those players. But when I moved to New York, it's such a humbling experience, because in Louisville I was one of 3 or 4 pretty decent bass players, and when I moved to New York I realized, there's scores and scores and scores of bass players.
There's 3 or 4 in the same building.
Right, 3 or 4 in the same building on the same night, on the same block. And I realized, they're the best of the best here in New York. There's also the worst of the worst.
Sure.
It's not all icing on the cake there, but it's there are a lot of great players, and like I learned from Red Mitchell, the important thing is to find your own path. Yeah. Because there's so many different paths, and I think if we compare it to the saxophone, like the saxophone was developed, and you had these great players like Coleman Hawkins and Lester Young who were virtuosos, and then the bebop players, and then the really technical players of the 60s, and the Michael Breckers and Jerry Bergonzi type players.
Yeah.
So the saxophone developed quite quickly in the jazz history, in the timeline. The bass players were still fulfilling the same function that Wellman Broad and Jimmy Blanton fulfilled back in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. But now we've got all these other influences, first from electric bass players, and then the high standard from classical bass players that jazz players have started to kind of co-opt.
Absolutely.
So bass playing today is still developing. We still are often obliged to fulfill this function like Jimmy Blanton did or Oscar Pettiford did back in the day. But the options that we have now technically are just unlimited. There's that's a long way around not answering your question. I feel like when I moved to New York, my big influences were the players like Dave Holland,
Yes.
Red Mitchell, and then also Ron Carter.
Have you had the pleasure of meeting Ron Carter?
I've met Ron many times over the years, just briefly. I've never taken lessons with Ron. He did a nice foreword for my book, The Jazz Bass Book.
Yes.
And he's played quite a few projects now with the WDR Big Band. So sometimes I'll rehearse Ron's music before he gets there, which is always fun.
Oh, wow.
Just one of the great influences on me. And also when I was first coming up in New York, I would see Ron often with Cedar Walton and Billy Higgins. To me, that was like the ultimate New York trio.
For me, with Ron Carter and Russell Malone on guitar, I just love that kind of, or Jim Hall, of course.
Right,
you know.
Yeah.
Wow, we could talk about jazz bass all day, John. I mean, what about in terms of your development as a player? Has classical music had much of an influence on you? Because you're obviously very proficient with the bow. You're known as somebody that solos with the bow and improvises with the bow. And you know, there aren't that many bass players, you know, that actually do that. You know, in the as regularly, I think, as you do. There are a lot of bass players that, you know, don't really go, you know, tend to use it much in a jazz context. So I wondered if you'd had many classical lessons, if that was part of your development when you were starting out in Louisville.
When I was in Louisville, I studied with a bass player, the principal with the Louisville Orchestra. His name's Dan Spurlock. And I had classical lessons for about 1 year. And when I started playing jazz, I realized I really liked Paul Chambers' bowed solos.
Yes.
So that was a sound I thought, well, why don't more people play bow solos? And I kept experimenting with playing bowed solos. And I realized, okay, in order to master this, or at least get in the ballpark, I should play some classical literature. I just started practicing the music on my own. I got albums from Ludwig Streicher.
Oh.
And I would play along with them, trying to imitate the sound. But that's another thing that's also changed. Jazz bass players have the option. It sort of seemed to start changing in the 70s when classical players like Frank Proto would write pieces for classical bass that included improvisation.
Yeah.
Or Arnie Eagleson, who was a studio bass player in L.A., is a great classical player. And he made a couple of records with Ray Brown on bass where he played bowed solos out front. Michael Moore, who I studied with, also liked to play with the bow and improvise with the bow. So I saw that as a way to develop another part of my voice, my solo voice. So I thought, it's not just about pizzicato playing. You know, you can also play a melody with the bow or play a solo with the bow, and it doesn't just have to be the last note of the ballad where you play a whole note. You know, you can add something to the ensemble sound with the bow.
So moving on to your life as an educator, this is one of the reasons why I was really excited to have you here, John, was not only as a performer do you have this sort of wealth of experience, and but also as a teacher and as an educator and as a writer. And there's several things that you've done that I'd really like to speak about. But maybe if we start at the beginning with your connection with Jamey Abersold, because this kind of relates to how you started out on the bass, is my understanding, that you're both from Louisville. And maybe you could talk a little bit about your views on jazz education and how you've how formal your training's been, or maybe in and out of a conservatory. I'm not sure. So how did that work out for you?
Well, I first saw Jamey Abersold. He came to my junior high school. I think I was in 8th grade, and he came there with a jazz group.
Yeah.
And he was playing electric bass.
Oh, wow.
And he was playing with the drummer Charlie Craig and Shelby James on piano, Mike Tracy on saxophone, John McNeil on trumpet. And my first reaction, because at that point I was playing electric bass, but I was playing rock and roll, I thought, oh, this music sounds kind of weird.
Yeah.
They were playing jazz standards. But I knew there was something there that I didn't quite understand that was kind of hip.
Yeah.
I realized that even, at age 14, however old I was, 13. Then a couple of years later, I went to one of his workshops where I met Rufus Reid, the great double bass player.
Absolutely.
And Jamey, I grew up in Louisville. He lives and still lives across the river in New Albany, Indiana.
Wow.
So he was a sort of a force on the Louisville jazz scene. And after I went to one of his workshops, he realized, there's this young kid who can play a blues and kind of walk a bass line in time, and I'll invite him over for sessions. So I started playing sessions at Jamey's house. And that was really a great growing experience for me. Also, there was a legendary jazz guitar player, Jimmy Rainey, who lived in Louisville at the time.
Oh, right.
Sometimes we would play sessions with Jimmy and Jamey in Jamey's basement. And I went to college for about 1 year at a local school in Louisville before I realized, I'm playing gigs with all the teachers, so I don't really, I'd rather stay home and practice than have to go attend classes every day. So I was working a lot of gigs in Louisville and playing with Jamey a lot and Jimmy Rainey and different players around town. And Jamey, at some point, I think it was about 1980, just before I moved to New York, I had been to a few of his workshops as a student, and he said, well, you can come next summer and you can teach. And I said, well, I don't know how to teach. I've never taught before, and actually I've never been through college, but I had learned Jamey's method, his way of explaining how to improvise and how to learn jazz, so I could sort of parrot that method, or I could explain the concepts in general terms. And he said, he gave me a good piece of advice. He says, the only thing you can teach is you can teach what you know. So figure out what you know how to do, and then that's the thing you teach in a master class or teach in your ensemble. And I was thinking, what do I know how to do? I can play quarter notes in time. I've got a pretty good sound. And he said, well, that's good. That's enough for a bass player. You teach him how to do that. Get a good sound and play quarter notes in time, and then you've done your job as a bass teacher. So that was my first experience teaching, kind of flying by the seat of my pants and trying to impart the little knowledge I had at that time to students who showed up at these Abersold workshops. And also I got to teach alongside other players like Rufus Reid and Wayne Darling and Ron McClure and Todd Kuhlman. So I learned a lot watching those players teach as well.
I think this is the thing about a lot of the stuff that you've done, John, is that you've been surrounded by fantastic players, not only other musicians but bass players all the way along the journey. It's really fascinating to me that it must have been a real joy to do those education workshops. I don't know if you remember actually, but I first met you in about 2003 or 4. I'm putting you on the spot here because I haven't actually mentioned this to you, but I'm not sure if you actually remember, but I attended one of the Abersold camps in London,
right.
And I went there specifically to meet you because of the Jazz Bass book, which had just been published. And what year was that published in? Do you remember?
I believe it was 2002.
I think, so it was around that period. It had just come out, and I'd been working through it, and I had this question. I was that annoying kid who had a question about the fingering for one of the passages, I was desperate to ask you about it, and you're kind of like, I don't know, you could do it this way or that way, and it was really useful. It was a triplet drop exercise.
Okay.
And the other thing that I pulled you to one side and pleaded for a lesson. You were very generous. You gave me a little bit of extra time before the start of the classes to look at jazz bowing, and because I'd been working on your jazz bowing book, so that was a real pleasure, and it must have been really exciting to be part of that experience with all the other teachers and all the other bass teachers, as you say, Rufus Reed and Todd Kuhlman and all of the other ones. Bob Sinecrope, I think, was on.
Bob Sinecrope, yeah. Still does them.
Yeah, it's fantastic. And are you still doing any more of these in future? Because we were just chatting earlier about that. What's the status?
I'm hoping to do one this summer. Jamey said that the last summer workshop would be his very last one, but then he's reconsidered and he's doing one now in 2019. So I still have to check my schedule to see if I can work it out to be there. I'd love to do it again. I'm still in contact with Jamey quite often, and
Right.
I consider him to be one of my mentors. And he's an incredible spirit, and he's really influenced the jazz world without ever leaving New Albany, Indiana, which is pretty amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think he's also renowned as the man that's counted in the most bands ever. With you hear that 1, 2, that kind of,
that's his Midwestern accent.
Exactly. The amount of time. I remember I drove back from a gig once, one of these things where a couple of hours drive, and I'm driving back with a friend, and we're in the car, and we've been listening to a record the whole time and not really spoken about what it was in the background. And as we pulled up in the drive and turned the ignition down, all of a sudden you hear this 1, 2, 3, 4, and I realised we've been listening to an Abersold recording the whole time and not realised.
Right.
So we've just been listening to these great backing tracks, and I mean, there's a real wealth of material in there. People who haven't had the experience with Jamey Abersold's programs and books and literature, you can go and buy books of transcriptions by Ron Carter, Rufus Reed, John Goldsby, and of course, so Jamey publishes several of your books, I believe. Is that right?
Right. He publishes Jazz Bowing Techniques for the Improvising Bassist.
Yeah.
And a bassline transcription book called Bass Notes.
Is there a recording that goes with that of you playing?
Right.
Or is, yeah.
Bass Notes has a recording that is from Play Along Records, but it's basically just transcribed bass lines, and then I describe how I approach playing the bass line and measure for measure. The Bowing Technique book also has a play-along CD, or a demo CD, where I demonstrate some of the bowing exercises.
Excellent. Well, I'd certainly recommend those. And this lastly, in terms of education, then maybe we can just, I know we've been going on a while here, so maybe we could just wrap up by talking a little bit about equipment, because people always love to hear about that, and I do as well. But just before we do that, I think one of your biggest contributions to the bass world is the Jazz Bass book. And, I've spoken about this a lot on Discoverable Bass in the past. It is my favourite book in terms of jazz education, full stop. I cannot say enough good things about it. I absolutely love it. And I use the language all the time. I've stolen so much of many of your licks. And what I love about it is the etudes, the instruction. I love the history throughout the book. There aren't many books I was recommend unreservedly. This one, Standing in the Shadows of Motown for bass guitar players, is another one that I think is just enormous in terms of its the fact that you can revisit it and keep looking at the material. And that also came from another really interesting journey in your life, which is your experience with Bass Player magazine. So for nearly 30 years, you were a contributing columnist, I believe, and I used to read your column. I read Bass Player magazine right from, I don't know, 1994, that kind of time was my first few editions that I've got, and I had it for, I think I kept going for, quite a number of years, and am I right in thinking that some of that material became the basis of the Jazz Bass book? And maybe you could talk a little bit about how that came about.
Sure. I started doing articles for Bass Player magazine, I think in 1991, and my first assignment there was to do a monthly column on historically important double bass players.
Oh.
So it was right up my alley, and also for me it was like a project where I can learn something about any number of players and then write about them, and by learning and listening and writing and transcribing, then I get a lot out of it, and hopefully I can pique the interest of some readers who might not know whoever I'm talking about. So I wrote about historical bass players, or historically important bass players, for many years, and then I started writing some technique articles, and there was the editor switched at the magazine over the years. There was a great editor named Richard Johnston who left Bass Player magazine and went to Backbeat Books, and then contacted me and said, well, all those articles you wrote for Bass Player, maybe you could flesh those out and do a few more chapters and organize it into a history of jazz bass playing, and then we could add some of your technique stuff in the back. So I think the Jazz Bass book is a good snapshot of how I learned how to play the bass. If anybody comes to me and we have 30 seconds to talk about, well, how do I learn how to play jazz bass? I would say, well, you have to listen to jazz. That's really important. You have to listen to all these players. Here's a list of all the players to listen to. Go have fun and find a few players who you really love to listen to and try and imitate those players. And then to imitate those players, you need the technical ability. You need the basic technical skills, and that's what I have in the back third of the book. Just a list of technical skills and a lot of the things that I practiced in order to get the competence to be able to imitate Oscar Pettiford or Ray Brown or Scott LaFaro or Red Mitchell or different bass players. So I think everybody has to find their own way in learning jazz bass. That's part of the problem, if it is a problem, with the educational system, is a lot of students go to a college and they want somebody to show them how to do it. You know, and after they spend a couple of semesters and waiting for someone to show them how to do it, hopefully they come upon the answer that, well, the way to do it is to listen to the recordings, watch really good bass players and musicians live, jump in there and try and play with them and figure out the technique, master the technique in order to realize the sound that they're hearing in their heads.
Absolutely. I mean, the development of the technique, often the repertoire leads the way, doesn't it? And if you're transcribing I don't know, Israel Crosby or something, or whoever, and then that will help you to deal with a new challenge, maybe playing arpeggios or something over, you know, a high range, and it all kind of fits together. I mean, just lastly on this sort of topic, is transcription something that you advocate for everybody? Is it a big part of your development as a player?
I transcribed a lot. I credit Jamey Abersold for giving me my first transcription project. He had recorded this play-along CD, Volume 6, called All Bird, that had Ron Carter on bass with Kenny Barron and Ben Riley. And Jamey wanted to put out a bass transcription book of Ron's bass lines. And he was talking to me about that, and I said, well, maybe I could try and transcribe them.
What a joy.
Yeah, and he said, oh, yeah, well, go transcribe those for me. And it was actually a great transcription project to start with, because on Jamey's records you can just isolate the bass. There was no slowdown program at that time, but it was very valuable, and I really got inside the way Ron plays his bass lines and plays rhythmic embellishments, and it's not harmonically as complicated as some people would like to think, but the feel he gets and the sound he gets and the way he delivers the lines are the key elements in the way he sounds. The
conviction of ideas, I think, you know, even things like the use of pedal tones, you know, that I always think I learned a lot from the transcription about that. It's really interesting, and listening to him as well, and just the way that he controls his you know, the band with his musical vision. It's just so strong, isn't it? You know, you can't fail to know what he's saying. You know, he's never meek in his idea. You know, true artist.
But what you were saying about the music determines what you need to practice. That's why I suggest people find music that really appeals to them. Like you said, Israel Crosby. If I listen to these Ahmad Jamal recordings with Israel Crosby, and I'm really digging Israel's bass lines, then I can say, well, what is it that he's actually doing? Yeah, I hear these arpeggios, and they go from the top of the bass to the bottom of the bass. Then that's a technical exercise that I need to work on. I need to work on 2-octave arpeggios in order to eventually be able to sound like Israel Crosby, or at least imitate Israel.
Well, John, you've been here with us all week, and it's been a real pleasure hanging out, but we haven't actually spoken in the interview about what you're doing here. You know, you're over in Leeds, we're in the studio, as you can see. Maybe you could tell everybody in the audience, you know, what you've been working on at Discoverable Bass, and what the intentions are for this project that we've been doing together.
Well, I wanted to create a couple of courses that addressed the exact path that I took when I was learning to play jazz on the double bass.
Okay.
So my philosophy when I teach is that we need to separate practicing into three parts. We need to just address purely technical things, and then address technique as applied to musical passages, and then just purely musical techniques. So technique, if we're talking about an arpeggio at a certain tempo, it's either in time and in tune, it's correct, or it's not. So we can take these little techniques. Am I getting a good sound? Am I shifting correctly? Is the note in tune? Is it right in the pocket in time? Those are technical things that I can just take apart the nuts and bolts and work on the smallest possible elements of technique. Then if I take that technique and I apply it to playing over a blues or playing over a standard or playing over one of my original tunes, that's a technique that I'm applying to music. It's not really music, it's more of an etude or an exercise. Then, like we've all heard, Charlie Parker, to paraphrase, said, yeah, then you learn all that stuff, then you forget it and just play music. So that's the third part that I'm hoping to demonstrate here. We're taking the time to record a few of my original tunes. So we're making trio tracks that are just original music, and then we'll dissect a little bit of that music to look into, well, what's the musical part, and are there techniques that we've practiced that apply to this musical performance.
I think one of the things that I've really loved has been the work that you've done with the trio. It's been really wonderful, and we've been able to set things up today so we can provide basically tracks to practice with that don't have the bass. So the courses and the lessons are all going to have the material that you play. They'll have the detailed transcriptions, and people will either be able to play along with you performing the track, or they'll be able to remove you, John, like they do on the Abersold. And
sure.
You know, we did in the old days where you pan left or right. I can't remember which way it was, and then the bass disappeared, and you've got the piano and the drums. And the exercises that you've brought and the etudes, there's been so much preparation. So I just wanted to say thank you for that. It was really been wonderful that you have put so much energy into the project, and I'm really excited about sharing it. So I'm sure everybody's kind of ready to switch the computer off if they've watched this far, because this has been quite long. I've been really enjoying chatting with you, John. Let's have a few quick fire questions. I'll ask you about your equipment. What double bass are you playing?
I have two main basses. One is a small German flatback bass, just a factory bass, probably from the 60s. It's a great sounding bass, and I use Spiracore Weich gauge strings, light gauge strings on that bass. A Fishman pickup. On small gigs, I'll use Gailey and Kruger 150 MB amp, mostly as a stage monitor, and then I have a DPA microphone that I like to send through the house. So usually for the house system, I don't give them any pickup sound. I only give them the microphone sound, but on stage I might have a little amplifier so everybody can hear me on stage.
So is that the full circle, or is that the BP100 that you're using?
People might cringe, but it's the BP100. I remember I mentioned this to John Patitucci once, and he said, no, you can't be still using that. And on that bass, I've tried other pickups, and the BP100 still sounds the best for what the bass is and for what I use it for, which is basically a monitor. That's
so important though, isn't it? Is that it sounds the best with what the bass is and what you're using it for. And it's, as much as I enjoy chatting about gear, people have to really remember this, that, you know, it sounds completely different. My bass sounds completely different when you were playing it this afternoon to when I play it. And you get a different sound and a different vibe from it. And definitely the MB150, the Gailey & Kruger amp, it's still a great option. It's really lightweight, works for Ron Carter, works for me, you know. It's you can take it anywhere really quickly, and I use different equipment that's a bit bigger now. And frankly, I look back at those days and think, you know, sometimes there's a lot to be said for an Underwood and an MB150 and Spiracore strings, because it's, you know, so strings, Spiracores, and then onto your main bass. I've just interrupted you.
Yeah, the bass I use at the WDR is made by Jean Array, a maker in Lyon, France. And yeah, it's a beautiful instrument, and I'm using gut strings by Gerold Gensler, a string maker in Berlin. A couple of years ago I started using these gut strings, and I really like, it's kind of opposite world from the Spiracore bass, but I really like the gut strings, especially with the big band, because there's a strong attack and then a quick decay. A lot of bass players today are looking for a pipe organ, a strong attack and a long sustain, but this bass it has a very round, warm sound, and it gets out of the way very fast of the ensemble. So if the horns are playing something and I play a bass note, you hear my note, and then it kind of disappears under the ensemble. It's still there, but it's more like a cork popping out of a champagne bottle rather than the
very direct
and long sustain of the Tomastic strings.
When I think about big band bass, that is the vibe that I really want. And if you're doing, so you do a series of concerts with Steinway, where I believe there's a bit of talking and playing. Am I right in thinking that?
Right.
What bass do you use for those? Would you use the gut strings in that context?
I use either bass in that context. That's a very small room. It's a small Steinway shop in Cologne, and I invite piano players to come in. I don't use any amp, and we play tunes, and then we just talk about the music, and we let the audience ask questions if they have any comments. Or
what a great idea!
So it's a nice contrast to my work in the big band, is just to go play duo with a piano player with no amp. And
so your Gerold Gensler strings, just, I know people will, if they are interested in these, will be the two things they're going to want to know are, one, what's the brand? Because I know he has a lot of different options. Is there a type?
Well, I use these strings called AP,
right,
and the AP 2018 are the ones I have now. He keeps changing them every year, but all-purpose.
Okay.
And he does have strings for more oriented to bowed work, and the all-purpose strings, I guess, he would say are good for bowing or pitts playing.
And how do you find the tuning stability in terms, I mean, not talking specifically in a way about his playing, but I find with gut strings, it's something that I kind of, I get drawn towards the sound and then step away sometimes because the clarity of pitch and stability in a Spiracore is just there. How do you find the stability with these?
They stay in tune really well. The quality of the sound, when you play a gut string, there's a lot of stretch in the string. So I think just because the string is stretching, there's a wide, colorful fundamental there. So sometimes it can sound, I wouldn't say out of tune, but it can sound like there's a wide fundament to the pitch, whereas the Spiracore has a very, I think if we looked at it on an oscillator or whatever, it would be a very synthesizer-like waveform. And I think the gut string would have more of a lively waveform.
I mean, this week we've been recording using Spiracore Vike, which I've just pronounced really badly, I know, because I noticed it was different to the way you pronounced say Vike for me, John.
Vike.
Vike. Thank you. Spiracore Vike. I will try and correct that in future.
But most people say, in the States, they say Vikes.
Ah, okay.
Do you play Vikes?
So you've been using them all week, and just on a German flatback bass for people. So I think the great thing is, Jean Array is one of the best luthiers in the world, and I imagine that his, instruments are hard to come by, and and the strings, they're very expensive strings, they're very, quite unusual. But we were both chatting earlier on about how, get a bass, put some Spiracore Vikes on, and really, you can do amazing things with that instrument. And you're still going and doing your duo performances, which, sound like a gig that you really care about the sound with your with both basses. And I think it's important that everybody kind of remembers that. I said to you earlier, I was really interested in trying some different strings, but I just have to remind myself I'd be better off spending my time practicing and leaving the strings on there because they work,
I should add that on the Jean Array bass, I do have a full circle pickup, and I play that through a Glockenklang, which is a German
boutique kind of
amplifier. It's just basically I have everything set flat and it sounds great. So I haven't messed with it.
Yeah. So that's the rig that you use for WDR. So we've
Right.
we've done amps, we've done pickups, and we've done strings, and we've done basses. So, John, that has been an absolute pleasure. I really appreciate you coming across and being part of the Discover Double Bass community, and for taking the time and the care in preparing all of these lessons so well. And we will absolutely be sharing as many of these as we can on YouTube, and also the full-length courses on Discover Double Bass. But maybe you could just finish off by letting people know where they can find you online. I mean, just lastly, we ran out of time to talk about this, but with teaching, do you offer any private tuition? Can people study with you in person?
I do teach every once in a while in Cologne, but not on a regular basis.
Sure.
I teach 1 day a month at the Maastricht Conservatory. That's in Holland, near the border of Germany, and they've got a very nice jazz program. And there's a bass faculty there. Matthias Novak is the bass teacher, and so I am teaching 1 day a month at a conservatory. If there's a student who's looking to do their bachelor's or master's, that's maybe a program to check out.
That's absolutely fantastic. And then, of course, we can go and check out your website, which I believe is johngoldsby.de. Am I right?
JohnGoldsby.com.
Ah, great. That'll get you
Yeah.
there. And obviously, you've got your social media channels. We'll provide links to all of those below. And I would just finish off by encouraging people to go and, if you don't own the Jazz Bass book, just go and buy it. Because, as I say, I've had my copy since, going on nearly 20 years or that kind of time, and it's served me really well. And stay tuned to Discover Double Bass, because we've got some great lessons and courses coming out. So thanks so much for watching. John, thank you again. I really appreciate all your time and hard work on this project.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me, and I look forward to seeing the finished product.
Yeah, fingers crossed. We'll get it all wrapped up as soon as possible, and we'll be looking forward to sharing that. So thanks so much for watching. We'll see you all next time.